All right, today we're going to break down a leadership manual that's, well, probably not like anything you'd find in a business school. This isn't your typical corporate training stuff. It sees leadership as something much deeper than just a skill set. It's a spiritual responsibility. So we're going to dive into its core principles, its unique models, and the really powerful stories it uses to get its points across. To really get what's at stake here, let's kick things off with a story from the source material. Picture this, a super busy rail yard. A baggage car gets loaded up, hooked onto a train, and sent on its way. The destination? Totally clear. Newark, New Jersey. And you've got 300 passengers who are kind of expecting their luggage to be there when they arrive. Except it wasn't. The car, and everything inside it, wound up in New Orleans, Louisiana. That is a full 1,500 miles from where it was supposed to be. I mean, talk about a massive, expensive, and seriously frustrating mistake. And that brings us right to the heart of what we're talking about today. How can one tiny little error cause such a gigantic diversion? You see, the manual uses this story as a metaphor for leadership. A seemingly small choice can put a team, a company, or even your own life on a completely different path. Now, we will get back to the answer, I promise. But first, we need to understand the bedrock of this manual's entire philosophy. So this manual doesn't start with, techniques or management hacks. It starts with a huge, grand vision. To really get its ideas on leadership, you first have to understand its ultimate role model, what it calls the divine blueprint for how leaders should think, act, and most importantly, serve. Right off the bat, leadership is framed as a calling. This isn't about climbing some corporate ladder or getting a bigger office. It's about becoming a light unto the world. From the very beginning, the argument is that a leader's real job is to lift up and illuminate everybody around them. And who's the ultimate model for this kind of leadership? Well, the manual is crystal clear. It's Jesus Christ. He's presented not just as a figure of faith, but as the perfect pattern of a leader. Someone whose entire focus was on completing a mission given to him by a higher authority, his Father, not on seeking his own glory. This quote right here gets to the absolute core of the philosophy. It just flips the typical power structure completely upside down. In this model, the leader is the servant. That means power isn't about command and control. It's earned through persuasion, through gentleness, and through what the manual calls love unfeigned. So how does this way of thinking stack up against other leadership styles? Well, the manual does something really smart here. It doesn't just present its ideal model in a bubble. It actually breaks down 3 very different styles, showing the pros and cons of each, which kind of forces you to really think about which path you're on. Okay, so here's the breakdown. First, you've got the manipulative style. That's all about the leader's ego, pure and simple. Then there's the directive style. Look, it gets results fast, but its huge flaw is that it creates followers who can't think for themselves. And finally, you have the participative style. It's all about getting the group invested, but man, it can be slow, and it can even slide into a sneaky kind of manipulation if you're not careful. And this quote just brilliantly nails the manual's biggest fear, especially about that directive leadership style. The goal isn't to create obedient followers. The goal is to develop people who can think for themselves, who don't just blindly hand over their destiny to someone else. True leadership, it's arguing, is about empowering people, not just ordering them around. Okay, so that's all the theory. But what does this actually look like in practice? Now we move from these big ideas into a very specific set of behaviors and traits, the actual practical toolkit for what it calls the servant leader. The first part of this toolkit is really all about your perspective. It's about seeing the deep, inherent value and potential in every single person. This kind of leader isn't focused on past mistakes. They're focused on making sure every single person on the team feels like they are a critical part of the success. This second set of traits is all about integrity. Principles like correcting in private, but praising in public. That's how you build trust. But maybe the most important one on this list is this: expecting more from yourself than you do from others. This isn't about being a demanding boss. It's a leadership style built on extreme personal accountability. Okay, let's go back to that baggage car. Remember the question, how could such a huge diversion even happen? The answer, according to the story, was a mistake of just 3 inches. Yep, a switchman in the St. Louis yard moved a tiny piece of steel, a switch point, by a mere 3 inches. A tiny, almost unnoticeable move by one person who probably wasn't even paying that much attention. And that 3-inch error, compounded over time and distance, resulted in a 1,500-mile diversion. A journey that was almost right at the very beginning became completely, hopelessly wrong by the end. And that is the punchline. The manual uses this story to drive home a fundamental principle: a leader's small, daily choices, a moment of carelessness, a dishonest shortcut, a failure to really listen, those are the switch points. They might seem totally insignificant at the time, but over the long haul, they determine the final destination for everyone you lead. This brings us to our last and maybe most important section: why? Why would anyone choose this hard path of servant leadership? What's the real motivation? Well, the manual argues it's not about pursuing a project, it's about being committed to a cause. To explain this, the manual tells this little parable about a man who buys a farm. He finds this overgrown currant bush, and he knows it needs pruning, so he cuts it way, way back. And in his mind, he hears the bush crying out, confused and hurt, saying, "How could you do this? I was growing so well, and now you've just cut me down." The man, as the gardener, answers the bush. He explains, "Look, I'm the gardener. I know what I want you to be. I don't want you to be some big, useless shade tree. I want you to be a fruitful currant bush." The painful pruning was actually an act of love, designed to help it fulfill its real potential. And then the author reveals that this whole parable is about his own life. After being denied a military promotion he desperately wanted, he was bitter. But he eventually came to see that moment of pruning as a blessing in disguise from a kind of divine gardener who had a better plan for him. He realized the pain was actually necessary for his true growth.
And that's the ultimate point here. That's the difference between a project and a cause. A project, like building a house, has an end, it's finished. But a cause, like trying to build a better world, is a lifelong commitment. For the servant leader, their work is driven by this deep, unwavering belief in a greater purpose, a gardener's plan that gives meaning even to the most painful setbacks.
So, we'll end with a final question from the manual itself. What truly defines a leader? Is it their motives, their actions, or their results? This manual strongly suggests that while actions and outcomes absolutely matter, the ultimate measure is the motive, the why behind it all. Because as we saw with that train, it's the internal direction, not just the external effort, that determines the final destination.